This is The Green Mummy by Fergus Hume, a work in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Unexpected Happens. In spite of newspapers and letters and tape machines and telegrams and such like aids to the speedy diffusion of news, the same travels quicker in villages than in cities. Word of mouth can spread gossip with marvellous rapidity in sparsely inhabited communities, since it is obvious that in such places every person knows the other, as the saying goes, inside out. In every English village, walls have ears and windows have eyes, so that every cottage is a hotbed of scandal, and what is known to one is, within the hour, known to the others. Even the Sphinx could not have preserved her secret long in such a locality. Gartley could keep up its reputation in this respect, along with the best, therefore it was little to be wondered at, that early next morning everyone knew that Professor Braddock had found his long-lost mummy in Mrs. Jasher's garden, and had removed the same to the pyramids without unnecessary delay. It was not particularly late when the handcart, with its uncanny burden, had passed along the sole street of the place, and several men had emerged from the Warrior Inn ostensibly to offer help, but really to know what the eccentric master of the great house was doing. Braddock brusquely rejected these offers, but the oddly shaped mummy case, stained green, having been seen, it needed little wit for those who had caught a sight of it to put two and two together, especially as the weird object had been described at the inquest and had been talked over ever since in every cottage. And as the cart had been seen coming out of the widow's garden, it naturally occurred to the villagers that Mrs. Jasher had been concealing the mummy. Shortly the rumour spread that she had also murdered Bolton, for unless she had done so, she certainly, according to village logic, could not have been possessed of the spoil. Finally, as Mrs. Jasher's doors and windows were small and the mummy was rather bulky, it was natural to presume that she had hidden it in the garden. Report said she had buried it, and had dug it up just in time to be pounced upon by its rightful owner, from which it can be seen that gossip is not invariably accurate. However this may be, the news of Professor Braddock's good fortune shortly came to Don Pedro's ears through the medium of the landlady. As she revealed what she had heard in the morning, the Peruvian gentleman was spared a sleepless night. But as soon as he learned the truth, which was surprising enough in its unexpectedness, he hastily finished his breakfast and hurried to the pyramids. As yet he had not intended to see Braddock so promptly, or at least not until he had made further inquiries at Pierside. But the news that Braddock possessed the royal ancestor of the de Gayangoses brought him immediately into the museum. He greeted the professor in his usual grave and dignified manner, and no one would have guessed from his inherent calmness that the unexpected news of Braddock's arrival, and the still more unexpected information about the green mummy, had surprised him beyond measure. Being somewhat superstitious, it also occurred to Don Pedro that the coincidence meant good fortune to him in the recovery of his long-lost ancestor. Braddock, already knowing a great deal about Don Pedro from Lucy and Archie Hope, was only too pleased to see the Peruvian, hoping to find in him a kindred spirit. As yet the professor was not aware of the contents of the ancient Latin manuscript, which revealed the fact of the hidden emeralds, since Hope had decided to leave it to the Peruvian to impart the information. Archie knew very well that Don Pedro, as he had plainly stated, wished to purchase the mummy, and it was only right that Braddock should know what he was selling. But Hope forgot one important fact, perhaps, from the careless way in which Don Pedro had told his story, namely, that the professor in a second degree was a receiver of stolen goods. Therefore it was more than probable that the Peruvian would claim the mummy as his own property. Still, in that event he would have to prove his claim, and that would not be easy. A plump little professor had not yet unsealed the case, and when Don Pedro entered, he was standing before it, rubbing his fat hands, with a gloating expression in his face. However, as Cockatoo had brought in the Peruvian's card, Braddock expected his visitor, and wheeled to face him. "How are you, sir?" said he, extending his hand. "I am glad to see you, as I hear that you know all about this mummy of Inca Cax's." "Well, I do," answered de Gayangos, sitting down in the chair which his host pushed forward. "But may I ask who told you that this mummy was that of the last Inca?" Braddock pinched his plump chin and replied readily, "Enough." "Certainly, Don Pedro. I wished to learn the difference in embalming between the Egyptians and the ancient Peruvians, and looked about for a South American corpse. Unexpectedly, I saw in several European newspapers and in 2 English journals that a green Peruvian mummy was for sale at Malta for £1,000. I sent my assistant, Sidney Bolton, to buy it, and he managed to get it, coffin and all, for £900. While in Malta, and before he started back in the diver with the mummy, He wrote me an account of the transaction. The seller, who was the son of a Maltese collector, told Bolton that his father had picked up the mummy in Paris some 20 and more years ago. It came from Lima some 30 years back, I believe, and, according to the collector in Paris, was the corpse of Inca Caxus. That is the whole story. Don Pedro nodded gravely. Was there a Latin manuscript delivered along with the mummy? He asked. Braddock's eyes opened widely. No, sir. The mummy came 30 years ago from Lima to Paris. It passed 20 years back into the possession of the Maltese collector, and his son sold it to me a few months ago. I never heard of any manuscript. Then Mr. Hope did not repeat to you what I told him the other night? The professor sat down, and his mouth grew obstinate. Mr. Hope related some story you told him and others about this mummy having been stolen from you. From my father, corrected the unsmiling Peruvian, keeping a careful eye on his host. That is really the case. Inca Caxus is, or was, my ancestor, and this manuscript. Don Pedro produced the same from his inner pocket, details the funeral ceremonies. Very interesting, most interesting, fussed Braddock, stretching out his hand. May I see it? You read Latin, observed Don Pedro, surrendering the manuscript. Braddock raised his eyebrows. Of course, he said simply, every well-educated man reads Latin, or should do so. Wait, sir, until I glance through this document. One moment, said Don Pedro, as the professor began to literally devour the discoloured page. You know from Hope, I have no doubt, how I chance upon my own property in Europe. Braddock, still with his eyes on the manuscript, mumbled, Your own property? Quite so, quite so. You admit that? Then you will no doubt restore the mummy to me. By this time, the drift of Don Pedro's observations entirely reached the understanding of the scientist, and he dropped the document he was reading to leap to his feet. Restore the mummy to you, he gasped. Why, it is mine. Pardon me, said the Peruvian, still gravely but very decisively. You admitted that it belonged to me. Braddock's face deepened to a fine purple. I didn't know what I was saying, he protested. How could I say it was your property when I have bought it for £900? It was stolen from me. That has got to be proved, said Braddock caustically. Don Pedro rose, looking more like Don Quixote than ever. I have the honour to give you my word, and— That is all right. I cast no imputation on your honour. I should think not, said the other coldly, but strongly. All the same, you can scarcely expect me to part with so valuable an object, Braddock waved his hand towards the case, without strict inquiry into the circumstances. And again, sir, even if you succeed in proving your ownership, I am not inclined to restore the mummy to you for nothing. But it is stolen property you are keeping from me. I know nothing about that. I have only your bare word that it is so, Don Pedro. All I know is that I paid £900 for the mummy, and that it cost the best part of another 100 to bring it to England. What I have, I keep. Like your country, said the Peruvian sarcastically. Precisely, replied the professor suavely. Every Englishman has a bulldog tenacity of purpose. Bragg is a good dog, Don Pedro, but Holdfast is a better one. Then I understand, said the Peruvian, stretching out his hand to pick up the fallen manuscript, that you will keep the mummy. Certainly, said Braddock coolly, since I have paid for it. Also, I shall keep the jewels, which the manuscript tells me, from the glance I obtained of it, were buried with it. The sole jewels buried are 2 large emeralds which the mummy holds in its hands, explained Don Pedro, restoring the manuscript to his pocket, and I wish for them so that I may get money to restore the fortunes of my family. No. No, no, said Braddock forcibly. I have bought the mummy and the jewels with it. They will sell to supply me with money to fit out my expedition to the tomb of Queen Tahosa. I shall dispute your claim, cried de Gallegos, losing his calmness. Braddock waved his hand with supreme content. I can give you the address of my lawyers, he retorted. Any steps you choose to take will only result in loss, and from what you hint I should not think that you had much money to spend on litigation. Don Pedro bit his lip, and saw that it was indeed a more difficult task than he had anticipated to make Braddock yield up his prize. If you were in Lima, he muttered, speaking Spanish in his excitement, you would then learn that I speak truly. I do not doubt your truth, answered the professor in the same language. De Gallegos wheeled and faced his host, much surprised. You speak my tongue, Signor? He demanded. Braddock nodded. I have been in Spain, and I have been in Peru, he answered dryly. Therefore I know classical Spanish and its colonial dialects. As to being in Lima, I was there, and I do not wish to go there again, as I had quite enough of those uncivilized parts 30 years ago, when the country was much disturbed after your civil war. You were in Lima 30 years ago, echoed Don Pedro. Then you were there when Vasa stole this mummy. I don't know who stole it, or even if it was stole it, said the professor obstinately. And I don't know the name of Vasa. Ah, now I remember. Young Hope did say something about the Swedish sailor who you said stole the mummy. Vasa did, and brought it to Europe to sell, probably to that man in Paris, who afterwards sold it to your Maltese's collector. No doubt, rejoined Braddock calmly, but what has all this to do with me, Don Pedro? I want my mummy, raged the other, and looked dangerous. Then you won't get it, retorted Braddock, adopting a pugnacious attitude and quite composed. This mummy has caused one death, Don Pedro, and from your looks I should think you would like it to cause another. Will you not be honest? I'll knock your head off if you bring my honesty into question, cried the professor, standing on tiptoe like a bantam. The best thing to do will be to take the matter into court. Then the law can decide, and I have little doubt but what it will decide in my favour. The Englishman and the Peruvian glared at one another, and Cockatoo, who was crouching on the floor, glanced from one angry face to another. He guessed that the white men were quarrelling, and perhaps would come to blows. It was at this moment that a knock came to the door, and a minute later Archie entered. Braddock glanced at him and took a sudden resolution as he stepped forward. Hope you are just in time, he declared. Don Pedro states that the mummy belongs to him, and I assert that I have bought it. We shall make you umpire. He wants it, I want it. What is to be done? The mummy is my own flesh and blood, Mr. Hope, said Don Pedro. Precious little of either about it, said Braddock contemptuously. Archie twisted a chair round and straddled his long legs across it, with his arms resting on its back. His quick brain had rapidly comprehended the situation, and, being acquainted with both sides of the question, it was not difficult to come to a decision. If it was hard that Don Pedro should lose his ancestor's mummy, it was equally hard that Braddock, or rather himself, should lose the purchase money, seeing that it had been paid in good faith to the seller in Malta for a presumably righteously acquired object. On these premises, the young Solon proceeded to deliver judgment. I understand, said he judiciously, that Don Pedro had the mummy stolen from him 30 years ago, and that you, Professor, bought it under the impression that the Maltese owner had a right to possess it. Yes, snapped Braddock, and I dare say the Maltese owner thought so too, since he bought it from that collector in Paris. Hope nodded. And if Vasa sold it to the man in Paris, said he calmly, he certainly would not tell the purchaser that he had looted the mummy in Lima, and the poor man would not know that he was receiving stolen goods. Is that right, Don Pedro? Yes, sir, said the Peruvian, who had recovered his temper and his gravity. But I declare solemnly that the mummy was stolen from my father and should belong to me. No one disputes that, said Archie cheerfully, but it ought to belong to the professor also, since he has bought it. Now, as it can't possibly belong to two people, we must split the difference. You, Professor, must sell back the mummy to Don Pedro for the price you paid for it, and then, Don Pedro, you must recompense Professor Braddock for his loss. I have not much money, said Don Pedro gravely. Still, I am willing to do as you say. I don't know that I am, protested Braddock noisily. There are the 2 emeralds which are of immense value, as Don Pedro says, and they belong to me, since the mummy is my property. Professor, said Archie solemnly, you must do right, even if you lose by it. I believe the story of Señor de Gallangos and the mummy with its jewels belongs to him. Besides, you only wish to see the way in which the Inca race embalmed their dead. Well then, unpack the mummy here in the presence of Don Pedro. When you have satisfied your curiosity, and when Señor de Gallangos signs a cheque for £1,000, he can take away the corpse. You have had so much trouble over it that I wonder you are not anxious to see the last of it. But the emeralds would sell for much money, and would defray the expenses of my expedition into Egypt to search for that queen's tomb. I understood from Lucy that Mrs. Jasher intended to finance that expedition when she became your wife. Humph, muttered Braddock, stroking his fat chin. I said a few foolish things to her last night when I was heated up. She may not forgive me, Hope. A woman will forgive anything to the man she loves, said Archie. Braddock was no fool, and could not help casting a glance at his tubby figure, which was reflected in a near mirror. It seemed incredible that Mrs. Jasher could love him for his looks, and the fact that he might someday be a baronet did not strike him at the moment as a consideration. However, he foresaw trouble and expense should Don Pedro go to law, as he seemed determined to do. Taking all things into consideration, Braddock thought that Archie's judgment was a good one and yielded. "Well," he said after reflection, "let us agree. I shall open the case and examine the mummy, which after all is the reason why I bought it. When I have satisfied myself as to the difference between the modes of embalming, Don Pedro can give me a cheque and take away the mummy. I only hope that he will have less trouble with it than I have had," and, so speaking, Braddock, signing to Cockatoo to bring all the necessary tools, laid hands on the case. "I am content," said Don Pedro briefly, and seated himself in a chair beside the young Daniel who had delivered judgment. Hope offered to assist the professor to open the case, but was dismissed with an abrupt refusal. "Though I am glad you are present to see the mummy unpacked," said Braddock, labouring at the lid of the case, "for if the emeralds are missing, Don Pedro might accuse me of stealing them." "Why should the emeralds be missing?" asked Hope quickly. Braddock shrugged his shoulders. "Sidney Bolton was killed," said he in a low voice, "and it was not likely that anyone would commit a murder for the sake of this mummy and then leave it stranded in Mrs. Jasher's garden. I have my doubts about the safety of the emeralds, else I would not have consented to sell the thing back again." With this honest speech, the professor vigorously attacked the lid of the case and inserted a steel instrument into the cracks to prise up the covering. The lid was closed with wooden pegs in an antique but perfectly safe manner, and apparently had not been opened since the dead Inca had been laid to rest therein hundreds of years ago among the Andean mountains. Don Pedro winced at this desecration of the dead, but, as he had given his consent, there was nothing left to do but to grin and bear it. In a wonderfully short space of time, considering the neatness of the workmanship and the holding power of the wooden pegs, the lid was removed. Then the four onlookers saw that the mummy had been tampered with. Swathed in green-stained llama wool, it lay rigid in its case. But the swathings had been cut, the hands protruded, and the emeralds were gone, torn rudely from the hard grip of the dead. Chapter 15. An Accusation. Both Don Pedro and Professor Braddock were amazed and angry at the disappearance of the jewels, but Hope did not express much surprise. Considering the facts of the murder, it was just what he expected, although it must be confessed that he was wise after the event. "I refer you to your own words immediately before the case was opened, Professor," he remarked, after the first surprise had subsided. "Words, words," snapped Braddock, who was anything but pleased. "What words of mine do you mean, Hope? You said that it was not likely that anyone would commit a murder for the sake of the mummy only, and then leave it stranded in Mrs. Jasher's garden. Also, you declared that you had your doubts about the safety of the emeralds, else you would not have consented to sell the mummy again to its rightful owner." The professor nodded. Quite so, and what I say I hold to," he retorted, "especially as I have proved myself a true prophet. You can both see for yourselves," he waved his hand towards the rifled case. "That poor Sidney must have been killed for the sake of the emeralds. The question is, who killed him?" "The person who knew about the jewels," said Don Pedro promptly. "Of course, but who did know?" "I was ignorant until you told me about the manuscript." "And you, Hope?" He searched Archie's face. "Do you intend to accuse me?" questioned the young man with a slight laugh. "I assure you, Professor, that I was ignorant of what had been buried with the corpse, until Don Pedro related his story the other night to myself and Random, and the ladies." Braddock turned impatiently to de Gallegos, as he did not approve of Archie's apparent flippancy. "Does anyone else know of the contents of this manuscript?" he demanded irritably. Don Pedro nursed his chin and looked musingly on the ground. "It is just possible that Vasa may." "Vasa? Vasa? Oh yes, the sailor who stole the mummy 30 years ago from your father in Lima. Pooh, pooh, pooh! You tell me that this manuscript is written in Latin, and evidently in monkish Latin at that, which is of the worst. Your sailor could not read it, and would not know the value of the manuscript. If he had, he would have carried it off." "Signor," said the Peruvian politely, "I have an idea that my father made a translation of this manuscript, or at all events a copy." "But I understood," put in Hope, still astride of his chair, "that you did not find the original manuscript until your father died." "That is quite true, sir," assented the other readily, "but I did not tell you everything the other night. My father, it was who found the manuscript at Cuzco, and although I cannot state authoritatively, yet I believe I am correct in saying that he had a copy made. but whether the copy was merely a transcript or actually a translation, I cannot tell. I think it was the former, as if Vaza, reading a translation, had learned of the jewels. He undoubtedly would have stolen them before selling this mummy to the Parisian collector. Perhaps he did, said Braddock, pointing to the rifled corpse. You see that the emeralds are missing. Your assistant's assassin stole them, insisted Don Pedro coldly. We cannot be sure of that, retorted the professor, although I admit that no man would jeopardize his neck for the sake of a corpse. Archie looked surprised. But an enthusiast such as you are, Professor, might risk so much. For once in his life, Braddock made a good-humoured reply. No, sir, not even for this mummy would I place myself in the power of the law, and I do not think that any other scientist would either. We savants may not be worldly, but we are not fools. However, the fact remains that the jewels are gone, and whether they were stolen by Vaza 30 years ago or by poor Sidney's assassin the other day, I don't know, and, what is more, I don't care. I shall examine the mummy further, and in a couple of days Don Pedro can bring me a cheque for 1,000 and remove his ancestor. No, no, cried the Peruvian hurriedly. Since the emeralds are missing, I am not in a position to pay you 1,000 English pounds, sir. I want to take back the body of Inca Caxus to Lima, as one must show respect to one's ancestors, but the fact is I cannot pay the money. You said that you could, shouted the exasperated professor in his bullying way. I admit it, senor, but I had hoped to do so when I sold the emeralds, which, as you can see, are not available. Therefore the body of my royal ancestor must remain here until I can procure the money. And it may be that Sir Frank Random will help me in this matter. He wouldn't help me, snapped Braddock, so why should he help you? Don Pedro, looking more dignified than ever, drew himself up to his tall height. Sir Frank, he said in a stately way, has done me the honour of seeking to be my son-in-law. As my daughter loves him, I am willing to permit the marriage, but now that I have learned the emeralds are lost, I shall not consent until Sir Frank buys the mummy from you, Professor. It is only right that my daughter's hand should redeem her regal forefather from purely scientific surroundings, and that she should take the mummy back to be buried in Lima. At the same time, sir, I must say that I am the rightful owner of the dead, and that you should surrender the mummy to me free of charge. What, and lose £1,000? Cried Braddock furiously. No, sir, I shall do nothing of the sort. You only wanted the mummy for the sake of the jewels, and now that they are lost, you do not care what becomes of your confounded ancestor, and you— The professor would have gone on still more furiously, but that hope, seeing Don Pedro was growing angry at the insult, chimed in. Let me throw oil on the troubled waters, he said smoothly. Don Pedro is not able to redeem the mummy until the emeralds are found. As such is the case, we must find the emeralds and enable him to do what is necessary. And how are we to find the jewels? Asked Braddock crossly. By finding the assassin. How is that to be done? Asked de Gallegos gloomily. I have been doing my best at Pierside, but I cannot find a single clue. Vaza is not to be found. Vaza! Exclaimed Archie and the professor, both profoundly astonished. Don Pedro raised his eyebrows. Certainly. Vaza, if anyone, must have killed your assistant, since he alone could have known that the jewels were buried with Inca Caxus. But, my dear sir, argued Hoke good-naturedly, if Vaza stole the manuscript, whether translated or not, he certainly must have learned the truth long, long ago, since 30 years have elapsed. In that event he must have stolen the jewels, as Professor Braddock remarked lately, before he sold the mummy to the Parisian collector. That may be so, said Don Pedro obstinately, while the professor muttered his approval. But we cannot be certain on that point. No one, I agree with the professor in this, would have risked his neck to steal a mere mummy. Therefore the motive for the committal of the crime must have been the emeralds. Only Vaza knew of their existence outside myself and my dead father. He, therefore, must be the assassin. I shall hunt for him, and, when I find him, I shall have him arrested. But you can't possibly recognize the man after 30 years, argued Braddock disbelievingly. I have a royal memory for faces, said Don Pedro imperturbably, and in the past I saw much of Vaza. He was then a young sailor of 20. Humph, muttered Braddock. He is now 50, and must have changed in 30 years. You'll never recognize him. Oh, I think so, said the Peruvian smoothly. His eyes were peculiarly blue and full of light. Also he had a scar on the right temple from a blow which he received in a street riot, in which I also was concerned. Finally, gentlemen, Vaza loved a peon girl on my father's estate, and she induced him to have the sun encircled by a serpent, a Peruvian symbol, tattooed on his left wrist. With all these marks, and with my memory for faces, which never yet has failed me, I have no doubt but what I shall recognize the man. And then I shall have him arrested." Hope shrugged his square shoulders. He had not much belief in Don Pedro's boasted royal memory, and did not think that he would recognize a young sailor of 20 in what would certainly be a grizzled old salt of 50 years. However, it was possible that the man might be right in his surmise, since Vaza alone could have known about the emeralds. The only doubt was whether he would have waited for 30 years before looting the mummy. Archie said nothing of these thoughts, as they would only serve to prolong an unprofitable discussion. But he made one suggestion. "Your best plan," he said suggestively, "is to write a description of Vaza, who, by the way, has probably changed his name, and hand it to the police, with the promise of a reward if he is found." "I am very poor, Senior. Surely the Professor here—" "I can offer nothing," said Braddock quickly, "as I am quite as poor as you are, if not more so. Sir Frank might help," he added sarcastically. "I shall not ask," said Don Pedro loftily. "If Sir Frank chooses to become my son-in-law by purchasing back my royal ancestor, to which you have no right, I am willing that it should be so. But poor as I am, I shall offer a reward myself, since the honour of the de Gayangoses is involved in this matter." "What reward do you suggest, Mr. Hope?" £500, said the Professor quickly. "Too much," said Hope sharply. "Far too much. Make the reward £100, Don Pedro. That is enough to tempt many a man." The Peruvian bowed and noted down the amount. "I shall go at once to Pierside and see Inspector Date, who had to do with the inquest," he remarked. "Meanwhile, Professor, please do not desecrate my royal ancestor's body more than you can help." "I shall certainly not search for any more emeralds," retorted Braddock dryly. "Now, clear out, both of you, and leave me to examine the mummy. Cockatoo, show these gentlemen out, and let no one else in." And Pedro returned to the Warrior Hotel to inform his daughter of what had taken place, with the intention of going in the afternoon to Pierside. Meanwhile, he wrote out a full description of Vaza, making an allowance for the lapse of years and explaining the scar and the symbol on the left wrist. Hope also sought Lucy and related the latest development of the case. The girl was not surprised, as she likewise believed that the assassin had desired more than the mummy when he murdered Sidney Bolton. "Mrs. Jasher did not know about the emeralds?" she asked suddenly. "No," replied Archie, much surprised. "Surely you do not suspect her of having a hand in the devilment?" "Certainly not," was the prompt answer. "Only I cannot understand how the mummy came to be in her garden. It was brought up from the river, I expect." "But why to Mrs. Jasher's garden?" Hope shook his head. "I cannot tell that. The whole thing is a mystery, and seems likely to remain so." "It seems to me," said the girl after a pause, "that it would be best for my father to return this mummy to Don Pedro and have done with it, since it seems to bring bad luck. Then he can marry Mrs. Jasher and go to Egypt on her fortune to seek for this tomb. I doubt very much if Mrs. Jasher will marry the Professor now, after what he said last night." "Nonsense, my father was in a rage and said what first came into his mind. I dare say she is angry. However, I shall see her this afternoon and put matters right. You are very anxious that the Professor should marry the lady." "I am," replied Lucy seriously, "as I want to leave my father comfortably settled when I marry you. The sooner he makes Mrs. Jasher his wife, the readier will he be to let me go, and I want to marry you as soon as I possibly can. I am tired of Gartley and of this present life." Of course, to this speech, Archie could make only one answer, and as that took the form of kissing, it was entirely satisfactory to Miss Kendall. Then they discussed the future, and also the proposed engagement of Sir Frank Random to the Peruvian lady. But both left the subject of the mummy alone, as they were quite weary of the matter, and neither could suggest a solution of the mystery. Meanwhile, Professor Braddock had passed a very pleasant hour in examining the sweathings of the mummy. But his pleasure was destined to be cut short sooner than he desired, as Captain Hiram Hervey unexpectedly arrived. Although Cockatoo, as he had been instructed, did his best to keep him out, the sailor forced his way in and heralded his appearance by throwing the Kanaka head foremost into the museum. "What does this mean?" demanded the fiery Professor, while Cockatoo, with an angry expression, struggled to his feet, and Hervey, smoking his inevitable cheroot, stood on the threshold. "How dare you treat my property in this careless way?" "Guess your property should behave itself then," said the captain in careless tones, and sauntered into the room. "I think I'm going to be chucked out by a measly nigger, and Great Scott!" This latter exclamation was extorted by the sight of the mummy. Braddock motioned to the still angry cockatoo to move aside and then nodded triumphantly. "You didn't expect to see that, did you?" he asked. Hervey came to anchor on a chair and turned the cherret in his mouth with an odd look at the mummy. "When will he be hanged?" Braddock stared. "When will who be hanged?" "The man as stole that thing." "We haven't found him yet," Braddock informed him swiftly. "Then how in creation did you annex the corpse?" The professor sat down and explained. The lean, long mariner listened quietly, only nodding at intervals. He did not seem to be surprised when he heard that the corpse of the head Inca had been found in Mrs. Jasher's garden, especially when Braddock explained the whereabouts of the property. "Wall," he drawled, "that don't make my hair stand on end." "I guess the garden was on his way, and he used it for a cemetery." "What are you talking about?" demanded the perplexed scientist. "About the man who strangled your help and yanked away the corpse." "But I don't know who he is. Nobody knows." "Go slow." "I do." "You," Braddock started, and flung himself across the room to seize Hervey by the lapels of his reefer coat. "You know. Tell me who he is, so that I can get the emeralds." "Emeralds?" Hervey removed Braddock's plump hands and stared greedily. "Don't you know?" "No, of course you don't." "2 emeralds were buried with the mummy, and they have been stolen." "Who by?" "No doubt by the assassin who murdered poor Sidney." Hervey spat on the floor, and his weather-beaten face took on an expression of profound regret. "I guess I'm a fool of the best." "Why?" asked Braddock, again puzzled. "To think," said Hervey, addressing the mummy, "that you were on board my boat, and I never looted you." "What?" Braddock stamped. "Would you have committed theft?" "Theft be hanged," was the reply. "It ain't thieving to loot the dead. I guess a corpse hasn't got any use for jewels. You bet I'd have gummed straightways onto that mummy when I brought it from Malta in the old diver, had I known it was a jeweller's shop of sorts." "Huh, 2 emeralds, and I never knew. I could kick myself." "You are a blackguard," gasped the astonished professor. "Oh, shucks," was the elegant retort. "Give it a rest. I'm no worse than that dandy gentleman who added murder to stealing, anyhow." "Ow!" Braddock bounded off his chair like an India rubber ball. "You said that you knew who had committed the murder." "Wall," drawled Hervey again. "I do and I don't. That is, I suspect, but I can't swear to the business before a judge." "Who killed Bolton?" asked the professor furiously. "Tell me at once." "Not me, unless it's made worth my while." "It will be, by Don Pedro." "That yellow stomach." "What's he got to do with it? I have just told you the mummy belongs to him. He came to Europe to find it. He wants the emeralds, and intends to offer a reward of £100 for the discovery of the assassin." Hervey arose briskly. "I'm right on the job," said he, sauntering to the door. "I'll go to that old inn of yours where you say the Don's stopping, and look him up. Guess I'll trade." "But who killed Bolton?" asked Braddock, running to the door and gripping Hervey by his coat. The mariner looked down on the anxious face of the plump little man with a grim smile. "I can tell you," said he, "as you can't figure out the business unless I'm on the racket. No, sir, I'm the white boy in Finn's circus." The professor shook the lean sailor in his anxiety. "Who is he?" "That almighty aristocrat that came on board my ship when I lay in the Thames on the very afternoon I arrived with Bolton." "Who do you mean?" demanded Braddock, more and more perplexed. "Sir Frank Random? What? Did he kill Bolton and steal my mummy, and hide it in that garden on his way to the fort?" "I guess he did." The professor sat down and closed his eyes with horror. When he opened them again, Hervey was gone. Chapter 16. The manuscript again. The professor was not going to let Captain Hervey escape without giving him full information. Before the Yankee skipper could reach the front door, Braddock was at his heels, gasping and blowing like a grampus. "Come back. Come back. Tell me all." "I reckon not," rejoined the mariner, removing Braddock's grip. "You ain't the one to give the money." "I'll go to the Don, or to Inspector Date of Pierside." "But Sir Frank must be innocent," insisted Braddock. "He's got to prove it," was the dry response. "Let me go." "No. You must tell me on what grounds." "Oh, the devil take you," said Hervey hastily, and sat down on one of the hall chairs. "It's this way, since you won't let me skip until I tell you. This almighty aristocrat came to Pierside on the same afternoon as I cast anchor. While Bolton was on board, he looked in to have a yarn of sorts." "What about?" "Now, how in creation should I know?" snapped the skipper. "I wasn't on hand, as I'd enough to do with unloading cargo, but his lordship went with Bolton to the stateroom, and they talked for half an hour. When they came out, I saw that his lordship had his hair riz and heard him saying things to Bolton. What sort of things? Well, for one, he said, you'll repent of this, and then again, your life isn't safe while you keep it, meaning the mummy. I reckon that's so, unless I am mistaken, said Hervey serenely. Why didn't you go to the police with this information? Me? Not much. Why, I saw no way of making dollars, and then, again, I did not think of putting things together until I found that his lordship, meaning Sir Frank, interpolated the professor, frowning. I'm talking queens, or kings, or Republican lingo, I guess, and I do mean his lordship, said the skipper dryly, until I found that his lordship had been in the public house where the crime was committed. The Sailor's Rest? When did he go there? In the evening. After his talk with Bolton, and after a row, as they both seemed to have their hair off, he skipped over the side and went back to his yacht, which wasn't far away. Bolton took his blamed mummy ashore and got fixed at the Sailor's Rest. I gathered afterwards, from the second mate of the Diver, which ain't my ship now, that his lordship came into the hotel and had a drink. Afterwards my second mate saw him talking to Bolton through the window. In the same place as the woman talked? Questioned the professor. That's so, only it was later in the evening that the woman came along to give chin music through the window. I am bound to say, added the captain generously, that no one I can place my hand on saw his lordship loafing about the hotel after dark. But what of that? He may have laid his plans and arranged for the corpse to be found later in that blamed packing case. Is this all your evidence? It's enough, I guess, not to procure a warrant. Why, a man in the States would be electrocuted on half the evidence. I dare say, retorted the little man with contempt, but we are in a land where justice of the purest prevails. All your evidence is circumstantial. It proves nothing. The captain was considerably nettled. I calculate that it proves Sir Frank wanted the mummy, else why did he come on board my ship to see your infernal assistant? The words he used showed that he was warning Bolton how he'd do for him, and then he talked through the window and was in the public house, which ain't a place for an almighty aristocrat to shelter in. I guess he's the man wanted by the police. Why? Added Hervey, warming to his tale. He'd a slap-up yacht laying near the blamed hotel, and could easily ship the corpse after slipping it through the window. When he got tired of it and looted the emeralds, he took it by boat below the fort to Mrs. Jasher's garden and left it there, so as to pull the wool over the eyes of the police. It's as clear as mud to me. You search his lordship's shanty and you'll find the emeralds. It is strange, muttered Braddock unwillingly. Strange, but not true, said a voice from the head of the stairs, and young Hope came down leisurely, with a pale face, but a very determined air. Random is absolutely innocent. How do you know? Demanded the skipper contemptuously. Because he is an English gentleman and my very good friend. I guess that defence won't save him from being lynched. Meanwhile Braddock was looking irritably at Archie. You've been listening to a private conversation, sir. How dare you listen? If you hold private conversations at the top of your voices in the hall, you must be expected to be listened to, said Archie coolly. I plead guilty, and I am not sorry. When did you come? In time to hear all that Captain Hervey has explained. I was chatting with Lucy, and had just left her, when I heard your loud voices. Has Lucy heard anything? No, she is busy in her room, but I'll tell her. Hope turned to mount the stairs. She likes Random, and will no more believe him guilty than I do at this present moment. Stop, cried Braddock, flying forward to pull Hope back as he placed his foot on the first stair. Tell Lucy nothing just now. We must go to the fort, you and I, to see Random. Hervey, you come also, and then you can accuse Sir Frank to his face. If he dares to do it, said Archie, who looked and felt indignant. Oh, I'll accuse him right enough when the time comes, said Hervey in his coolest manner. But the time isn't now. Savey, I am going to see the Don first and make sure of this reward. Faugh! Cried Hope with disgust. Blood money! What of that? If the man is a murderer, he should be lynched. My friend, Sir Frank Random, is no murderer. He's got to prove that, as I said before, rejoined the Yankee in a calm way, and strolled to the door. So long, gents both. I'll light out for the Warrior Inn and play my cards, and I may tell you, he added, pausing at the door which he opened, that I haven't got that blamed windjammer, so need money to hold out until another steamer comes along. £100 English currency will just fill the bill, so now you know the lay. I'm on. So long. And he walked quietly out of the house, leaving Archie and Braddock looking at one another with pale faces. The assurance of Hervey surprised and horrified them. Still, they could not believe that Sir Frank Random had been guilty of so brutal a crime. For one thing, said Hope after a pause, Random did not know where the emeralds were to be found, or even that they existed. I understood that he did know, said Braddock reluctantly. In my hearing, and in your own, you heard Don Pedro state that he had related the story of the manuscript to Random. You forget that I learned about the emeralds at the same time, said Hope quietly. Yet this Yankee skipper does not accuse me. The knowledge of the emeralds came to Random's ears and to mine long after the crime was committed. To have a motive for killing Bolton and stealing the emeralds, Random would have had to know when he arrived in England. And why should he have not known? Asked the Professor, biting his lip vexedly. I don't want to accuse Random, or even to doubt him, as he is a very good fellow, even though he refused to assist me with money when I desired a reward to be offered. All the same, he met Don Pedro in Genoa, and it is just possible that the man told him of the jewels buried with the mummy. Archie shook his head. I doubt that, said he thoughtfully. Random was as astonished as the rest of us when Don Pedro told his Arabian Night story. However, the point can be easily settled by sending for Random. I dare say he is at the fort. I shall send Cockatoo for him at once, said the Professor quickly, and walked into the museum to instruct the Kanaka. Archie remained where he was and seated himself on a chair with folded arms and knitted brows. It was incredible that an English gentleman with a stainless name and such a well-known soldier should commit so terrible a crime. And the matter of Hervey's accusation was complicated by the fact, of which Hervey was ignorant, that Don Pedro was willing that Random should become his son-in-law. Hope wondered what the fiery, proud Peruvian would say when he heard his friend denounced. His reflections on this point were cut short by the return of the Professor, who appeared at the door of the museum dismissing Cockatoo. When the Kanaka took his departure, Braddock beckoned to the young man. There is no reason why we should talk in the hall and let the whole house know of this new difficulty, he said in a testy manner. Come in here. Hope entered and looked with ill-concealed repugnance at the uncanny shape of the green mummy, which was lying on a long table. He examined the portions where the swathings had been cut with some sharp instrument to reveal the dry, bony hands which formerly had held the costly jewels. The face was invisible and covered with a mask of dull beaten gold. Formerly the eyes had been jewelled, but these last were now absent. He pointed out the mask to the Professor, who was hovering over the weird dead with a large magnifying glass. It is strange, said Hope earnestly, that the mask of gold was not stolen also, since it is so valuable. Unless melted down, the mask could be traced, said Braddock after a pause. The jewels, according to Don Pedro, are of immense value, and so could have been got rid of easily. Random was satisfied with those. Don't talk of him in that way, as though his guilt was certain, said Hope, wincing. Well, you must admit that the evidence against him is strong, but purely circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence has hanged many an innocent man before now. Humph, said Braddock uneasily. I hope it won't hang our friend. However, we shall hear what he has to say. I have sent Cockatoo to the fort to bring him here at once. If Random is absent, Cockatoo is to leave a note in his room, on the writing table. Would it not have been better to have told Cockatoo to give the note to Random's servant? I think not, responded Braddock dryly. Random's servant is certainly one of the most stupid men in the entire army. He would probably forget to give him the note, and as it is important that we should see Random at once, it is better that he should find it placed personally on his writing table by Cockatoo, upon whom I can depend. Archie abandoned the argument, as it really mattered very little. He took up another line of conversation. I expect if the criminal tries to dispose of the emeralds he will be caught, said he. Such large jewels are too noticeable to escape comment. Humph! It depends upon the cleverness of the thief, said the Professor, who was more taken up with the mummy than with the conversation. He might have the jewels cut into smaller stones, or he might go to India and dispose of them to some Rajah, who would certainly say nothing. I don't know how criminals act myself, as I have never studied their methods. But I hope that the clue you mention will be hit upon, if only for Random's sake. I don't believe for one moment that Random is in danger, said Archie, and, if he is, I shall turn detective myself. I wish you joy, replied Braddock, bending over the mummy. Look, Hope, at the wonderful colour of this wool. There are some arts we have lost completely. Dyeing of this surprising beauty is one. Humph, mused the archaeologist. I wonder why this particular mummy is dyed green, or rather why it is wrapped in green bandages. Yellow was the royal colour of the ancient Peruvian monarchs. Bituna wool dyed yellow. What do you think, Hope? It is strange. Archie shrugged his shoulders. I can say nothing, because I know nothing, he said sharply. All I do know is that I wish this precious mummy had never been brought here. It has caused trouble ever since its arrival. Well, said Braddock, surveying the dead with some disfavour, I must say that I shall be glad to see the last of it myself. I know now all that I wanted to know. Humph. I wonder if Don Pedro will allow me to strip the mummy. Of course, it is mine, not his. I shall unswathe it entirely. And Braddock was about to lay sacrilegious hands on the dead when Cockatoo entered breathlessly. He had been so quick that he must have run to the fort and back again. I knock at door, said the Kanaka, delivering his message, and I hear no voice. I go in and find no one, so I put the letter on the table. I come down and ask, and a soldier tells me, Sir, his master is coming back in half an hour. You should have waited, said Braddock, waving Cockatoo aside. Come along with me to the fort, Hope. But Random will come here as soon as he returns. Very likely, but I can't wait. I am anxious to hear what he has to say in his defence. Come, Cockatoo, my coat, my hat, my gloves. Stir yourself, you scoundrel. Archie was not unwilling to go, since he was anxious also to hear what Random would say to the absurd accusation brought against him by the Yankee. In a few minutes, the two men were walking smartly down the road through the village, the Professor striving to keep up with Hope's longer legs by trotting as hard as he could. Halfway down the village they met a trap, and in it Captain Hervey being driven to the Jasher railway station. Have you seen Don Pedro? Asked the Professor, stopping the vehicle. I reckon not, answered Hervey stolidly. He's gone into Pierside to see the police. I'm off there also. You had better come with us, said Archie sternly. We are going to see Sir Frank Random. Give him my respects, said the skipper cold-bloodedly, and say that he's worth £100 to me. He waved his hand, and the trap moved away, but he looked back with a wry smile. Say I'll square the matter for double the money and command of his yacht. Braddock and Archie looked after the trap in disgust. What a scoundrel the man is, said the Professor pettishly. He'd sell his father for what he could get. It shows how much his word is to be depended upon. I expect this accusation of Random is a put-up job. I hope so, for Random's sake, said Braddock, trotting briskly along. In a short time they arrived at the fort and were informed that Sir Frank had not yet returned, but was expected back every moment. In the meanwhile, as Braddock and Hope were both extremely well known, they were shown into Random's quarters, which were on the first floor. When the soldier servant retired and the door was closed, Hope seated himself near the window, while Braddock trotted round looking into things. It's a dog kennel, said the Professor. I told Random that. Perhaps we should have waited him in the mess, suggested Archie. No, no, no! We couldn't talk there with a lot of silly young fools hanging about. I told Random that I would never enter the mess, so he invited me to come always to his quarters. He was in love with Lucy then, chuckled the Professor, and nothing was too good for me. Not even the dog kennel, said Hope dryly, for the Professor's chatter was so rude as to be quite annoying. Pooh, pooh, pooh! Random doesn't mind a joke. You, Hope, have no sense of humour. Your name is Scotch also. I believe you are a Caledonian. I am nothing of the sort. I was born on this side of the border. You might have been born at the North Pole for all I care, said the little man politely. I don't like artists, they are usually silly. I wish Lucy had married a man of science. Now don't talk rubbish. I know what you are going to say. Well, said Archie, humouring him, what am I going to say? This nonplussed the irritable savant. Hum, I don't know and don't care. Poof! How hot this room is. What a number of books of travel Random has. Braddock was now at the bookcase, which consisted of shelves swung by cords against the wall. Random travels a great deal, Archie reminded him. Quite so, wastes his money on that silly yacht. But he hasn't travelled in South America. I expect he's going there. Come here, Hope, and see the many, many books about Peru and Chile and Brazil. There must be a dozen, and all library books too. Archie sauntered towards the shelves. I expect Random is getting up the subject of South America so as to talk to Donna Inez. Probably, snapped Braddock, pulling several of the books out of place. Why, there isn't a— Ah, dear me, what a catastrophe! He might well say so, for in his desire to examine the books, they all tipped off the shelves and lay in a disorderly heap on the floor. Hope began to pick them up and replace them, and so did the author of the mischief. Among the books were several papers scribbled with notes, and Braddock bundled these all in the heap. Shortly, he caught sight of the writing on one. "Hello." "Latin," said he, and read a line or two. "Oh," he gasped, "Hope, Hope, the manuscript of Don Pedro." "Impossible." Archie rose and stared at the discoloured paper. "Sorry to have kept you," said Random, entering at this moment. "You villain!" shouted Braddock furiously. "So you are guilty after all." Chapter 17. Circumstantial Evidence. Random was so taken aback by the fierce accusation of the professor that he stood suddenly still at the door and did not advance into the room. Yet he did not look so much afraid as puzzled. Whatever Braddock might have thought, Hope, from the expression on the young soldier's face, was more than ever satisfied of his innocence. "What are you talking about, Professor?" asked Random, genuinely surprised. "You know well enough," retorted the professor. "Upon my word I don't," said the other, walking into the room and unbuckling his sword. "I find you here, with the contents of my bookcase on the floor, and you promptly accuse me of being guilty. Of what, I should like to know? Perhaps you can tell me, Hope." "There is no need for Hope to tell you, sir. You are perfectly well aware of your own villainy." Random frowned. "I allow a certain amount of latitude to my guests, Professor," he said with marked dignity, "but for a man of your age and position you go too far. Be more explicit." "Allow me to speak," intervened Archie, anticipating Braddock. "Random, the professor has just had a visit from Captain Hiram Hervey, who was the skipper of the diver. He accuses you of having murdered Bolton." "What?" The baronet started back, looking thunderstruck. "Wait a moment. I have not finished yet. Hervey accuses you of this murder, of stealing the mummy, of gaining possession of the emeralds, and of placing the rifled corpse in Mrs. Jasher's garden so that she might be accused of committing the crime." "Exactly," cried Braddock, seeing that his host remained silent from sheer surprise. "Hope has stated the case very clearly. Now, sir, your defence?" "Defence! Defence!" Random found his tongue at last and spoke indignantly. "I have no defence to make." "Ah, then you acknowledge your guilt. I acknowledge nothing. The accusation is too preposterous for any denial to be necessary. Do you believe this of me?" He looked from one to the other. "I don't," said Archie quickly. "There is some mistake." "Thank you, Hope. And you, Professor?" Braddock fidgeted about the room. "I don't know what to think," he said at length. Hervey spoke very decisively. "Oh, indeed," returned Random dryly, and walking to the door, he locked it. "In that case, I must ask you for an explanation, and neither of you shall leave this room until one is given." "Your proofs?" "Here is one of them," snapped Braddock, throwing the manuscript on the table. "Where did you get this?" Random took up the discoloured paper with a bewildered air. "I never set eyes on this before," he said, much puzzled. "What is it?" "A copy of the manuscript mentioned by Don Pedro, which describes the 2 emeralds buried with the mummy of Inca Caxus." "I see." Random understood all in a moment. "So you say that I knew of the emeralds from this, and so murdered Bolton to obtain them." "Pardon me," said Braddock with elaborate politeness. "Hervey says that you murdered my poor assistant, and although my discovery of this manuscript proves that you must have known about the jewels, I say nothing. I wait to hear your defence." "That's very good of you," remarked Sir Frank ironically. "So it seems that I am in the dock. Perhaps the counsel for the prosecution will state the evidence against me," and he looked again from one to the other. Archie shook the baronet by the hand very warmly. "My dear fellow," he declared decidedly, "I don't believe one word of the evidence." "In that case there must be a flaw in it," retorted Random, but did not seem to be unmoved by Hope's generous action. "Sit down, Professor. It appears that you are against me." "Until I hear your defence," said the old man obstinately. "I cannot make any until I hear your evidence. Go on. I am waiting." And Sir Frank flung himself into a chair, where he sat calmly, his eyes steadily fixed on the professor's face. "Where did you get that manuscript?" asked Braddock sharply. "I got it nowhere. This is the first time I have seen it. Yet it was hidden amongst your books." "Then I can't say how it got there. Were you looking for it?" "No, certainly not. To pass the time while waiting, I examined your library, and in pulling out a book, your case, being a swing one, overbalanced and shot its contents onto the floor. Amongst the papers which fell with the books, I caught a glimpse of the manuscript, and, noting that it was written in Latin, I picked it up, surprised to think that a frivolous young man, such as you are, should study a dead language. A few words showed me that the manuscript was a copy of the one referred to by Don Pedro. "One moment," said Archie, who had been thinking. "Perhaps this is the original manuscript which de Giangos has given to you, random." "It is good of you to afford me a loophole of escape," said Sir Frank, leaning back with folded arms, "but de Giangos gave me nothing. I saw the manuscript in his hands when he showed it to us all at Mrs. Jasher's. But whether this is the original or a copy I can't say. Don Pedro certainly did not give it to me." "Has Don Pedro been in your quarters?" asked Hope thoughtfully. "No, he has only visited me in the mess. And even if Don Pedro did come in here, for I guess what is in your mind, I really do not see why he should slip a manuscript which he values highly amongst my books." "Then you really never saw this before?" said Braddock, indicating the paper on the table and impressed by Random's earnestness. "How often do you want me to deny it?" retorted the young man impatiently. "Perhaps you will state on what grounds I am accused." Braddock nodded and cleared his throat. "Captain Hervey declared that your yacht arrived at Pierside almost at the same time as his steamer." "Quite right. When Don Pedro received a wire from Malta stating that the mummy had been sold to you and that it was being shipped to London on the Diver, I got up steam at once and chased the tramp to that port. As the tramp was slow and my boat was fast, I arrived on the same day and almost at the same hour, even though Hervey's boat had the start of mine." "Why were you anxious to follow the Diver?" asked Hope. "Don Pedro wished to get back the mummy and asked me to follow. As I was in love with Donna Inez, and still am, I was only too willing to oblige him." Braddock nodded again. "Hervey says that you went on board the Diver and had an interview with Bolton." "That is perfectly true, and my visit was paid for the same reason as I followed the steamer to London. That is, I acted on behalf of Don Pedro. I wished to ascertain for certain that the mummy was on board, and having done so from Bolton, I urged him to induce you to give back the same, free of charge, to de Giangos, from whom it had been stolen. He refused, as he declared that he intended to deliver it to you." "I knew I could always trust Bolton," said the Professor enthusiastically. "It would have been better for you to have come to me, random. I dare say, but I wished, as I told you, to make certain that the mummy was on board. That was the real reason for my visit. But, being in Bolton's company, I naturally told him that Don Pedro claimed the mummy as his property, and warned him that if you or he kept the same, that there would be trouble." "Did you use threats?" asked Hope, remembering what he had overheard. "No, certainly not." "Yes, you did," cried Braddock quickly. "Hervey declares that you told Bolton that he would repent of keeping the mummy, and that his life would not be safe while he held it." To the surprise of both visitors, Random admitted using these serious threats without a moment's hesitation. "Don Pedro told me that many Indians, both in Lima and Cuzco, who look upon him as the lawful descendant of the last Inca, are anxiously expecting the return of the royal mummy. He also stated that when the Indians knew who held the mummy, they would send one of themselves to get it back, if he, Don Pedro, that is, did not fetch it. To get back the mummy, Don Pedro declared that these Indians would not stop short of murder, hence my warning to Bolton." "Oh," Archie jumped up with widely opened eyes. "Then perhaps this solves the problem. Bolton was murdered by some Peruvian Indian." Random shook his head gravely. "Again you offer me a loophole of escape, my dear fellow," he said sententiously, "but that theory will not hold water. At present the Indians in Lima and Cuzco do not know that the mummy has been found. Don Pedro only chanced upon the paper which announced the sale by accident, and had no time to communicate with his barbaric friends in South America. Failing to get the mummy from you, Professor, he would have returned to Peru, and then would have told who possessed the corpse of Inca Caxus, leaving the Indians to deal with the matter. In that case, my warning to Bolton would be necessary. But at the time I told him, it was not necessary. However, Bolton remained true to you, Professor, and declined to surrender the mummy. I therefore wired to Don Pedro at Genoa that the mummy was on board the Diver and was being sent to Gartley. I also advised him to come to me here in order to be introduced to you. The rest you know." There was a moment's silence. Then Archie, to test if Random was willing to admit everything, as an innocent man certainly would, asked significantly, "Did you see Bolton again after your interview on board ship?" It was then that the baronet proved his good faith. "Oh, yes," he said easily and without hesitation. "I was walking about Pierside later, and passing along that waterside alley near the Sailor's Rest, I saw a window on the ground floor open and Bolton looking out across the river. I stopped and asked him when he proposed to take the mummy to Gartley and if it was on shore. He admitted that it was in the hotel, but declined to say when he would send it on to you, Professor. When he closed the window, I afterwards went into the hotel and had a drink in order to ask casually when Mr. Bolton intended to leave. I gathered, not directly of course, but in a roundabout way, that he had arranged to go next morning and to send on his luggage. Then I left and went to London. In the course of time I returned here and learned of the murder and the disappearance of the corpse of Inca Caxus. And now, Random stood up, having admitted all this, perhaps you will believe me to be innocent. You have no idea who murdered Bolton and placed his body in the packing case? Asked Braddock, manifestly disappointed. No more than I have any idea of the person who placed the mummy case and its contents in Mrs. Jasher's garden. Oh, you know that, said Archie quickly. Yes, the news was all over the village this morning. I could hardly help knowing it, and I believe that the mummy has been taken to your house, Professor. It has, admitted Braddock dryly. I took it myself from Mrs. Jasher's arbour in a handcart, with the assistance of Cockatoo. But when I made an examination this morning in the presence of Hope and Don Pedro, I found that the swathings of the body had been ripped up, and that the emeralds mentioned in that manuscript had been stolen. Strange, said Random with a frown. And by whom? No doubt by the assassin of Sidney Bolton. Probably. Random kicked a mat straight with his foot. At any rate, the theft of the emeralds shows that it was not any Indian who killed Bolton. None of them would rifle so sacred a corpse. Besides which, as you say, the Indians in Peru do not know that the mummy has reappeared after 30 years' seclusion, chimed in Hope, rising. Well, and what is to be done now? For answer, Sir Frank picked up the manuscript which still remained on the table. I shall see Don Pedro about this, he said quietly, and ascertain if it is the original or a copy. Braddock rose slowly and stared at the paper. Do you know Latin? He asked. No, rejoined Random, knowing what the savant meant. I learned it, of course, but I have forgotten much. I might translate a word or two, but certainly not the hedge priest Latin in which this is written. He looked carefully at the manuscript as he spoke. And who could have placed it in your room? Questioned Archie. We cannot learn that until we see Don Pedro. If this is the original manuscript which we saw the other night, we may learn how it passed from the possession of de Gayangos to my bookcase. If it is a copy, then we must learn, if possible, who owned it. Don Pedro said that a transcript or a translation had been made, mentioned Hope. Evidently a transcript, said Braddock, glaring at the paper in Random's hand. But how could that find its way from Lima to this place? It might have been packed up with the mummy, suggested Archie. No, contradicted Random decisively. In that event, the man in Malta from whom the mummy was bought would have discovered the emeralds and would have taken them. Perhaps he did. We have nothing to show that Bolton's assassin committed the crime for the sake of the jewels. He must have done so, cried the Professor irritably, else there is no motive for the commission of the crime. But I think myself that we must start at the other end to find a clue, when we discover who placed the mummy in Mrs. Jasher's garden. That will not be easy, murmured Hope thoughtfully, though of course the same must have been brought by river. Let us go down to the embankment and see if there are any signs of a boat having been brought there last night. And he moved to the door. Random. I cannot leave the fort, as I am on duty, replied the officer, putting the manuscript away in a drawer and locking the same. But this evening I shall see Don Pedro, and in the meanwhile I shall endeavour to learn from my servant who visited me lately while I was absent. The manuscript must have been brought here by someone. But I trust, he added as he escorted his 2 visitors to the door, that you now acquit me of— Yes, cried Braddock, hastily cutting him short and shaking his hand. I apologise for my suspicions. Now I maintain that you are innocent. And I never believed you to be guilty, cried Hope heartily. Thank you both, said Random simply, and, having closed the door, he returned to a chair near the fire to smoke a pipe and meditate over his future movements. An enemy hath done this, said Random, referring to the concealment of the manuscript, but he could think of no one who desired to harm him in any way. Chapter 18. Recognition. Lucy and Mrs. Jasher were having a confidential conversation in the small pink drawing-room. True to her promise, Miss Kendall had come to readjust matters between the fiery little professor and the widow. But it was not an easy task, as Mrs. Jasher was righteously indignant at the rash words used to her. As if I knew anything about the matter, she repeated again and again in angry tones. Why, my dear, he as good as told me I had murdered. Lucy did not let her finish. There! she said, speaking as she would have done to a fretful child. "You know what my father is." "It seems to me that I am just beginning to learn," said the widow bitterly. "And knowing how ready he is to believe ill of me, I think it is better we should part forever." "But you'll never be Lady Braddock." "Even if I married him, I am not sure that I should be, since I learn that his brother is singularly healthy and comes of a long-lived family. And it will not be pleasant to live with your father when he has such a temper." "That was only because he was excited. Think of your salon, and of the position you wish to hold in London." "Ah, well," said Mrs. Jasher, visibly softening. "There is something to be said there. After all, one can never find a man who is perfection. And a very amiable man is usually a fool. One can't expect a rose to be without thorns. But really, my dear," she surveyed Lucy with mild surprise, "you appear to be very anxious that I should marry your father." "I want to see my father made comfortable before I marry Archie," said the girl with a blush. "Of course, my father is quite a child in household affairs and needs everything done for him. Archie, I am glad to say, is now in a position to marry me in the spring. I want you to be married about the same time, and then you can live in Gartley and—" "No, my dear," said Mrs. Jasher firmly. "If I marry your father, he wishes us to go at once to Egypt in search of this tomb. I know that he wants you to help with the money left to you by your late brother, but surely you will not go up the Nile yourself." "No, certainly not," said the widow promptly. "I shall remain in Cairo while the Professor goes on his excursion into Ethiopia. I know that Cairo is a very charming place, and that I shall be able to enjoy myself there." "Then you have decided to forgive my father for his rash words." "I must," sighed Mrs. Jasher. "I am so tired of being an unprotected widow without a recognized position in the world. Even with my brother's money, not that it is so very much, I shall still be looked upon askance if I go into society. But as Mrs. Braddock or Lady Braddock, no one will dare to say a word against me. Yes, my dear, if your father comes and asks my pardon, he shall have it." "We women are so weak," ended the widow virtuously, as if she was not making a virtue of necessity. Things being thus settled, the two talked on amiably for some time and discussed the chances of Random marrying Donna Inez. Both acknowledged that the Peruvian lady was handsome enough, but had not a word to say for herself. While thus chattering, Professor Braddock trotted into the room, looking brisk and bright from his stroll in the cold, frosty air. Gifted as he was with scientific assurance, the little man was not at all taken aback by the cold reception of Mrs. Jasher, but rubbed his hands cheerfully. "Ah, there you are, Selina," said he, looking like a bright-eyed robin. "I hope you are feeling well." "How can you expect me to feel well after what you said?" remarked Mrs. Jasher reproachfully, and anxious to make a virtue of forgiveness. "Oh, I beg pardon. I beg pardon. Surely, Selina, you are not going to make a fuss over a trifle like that? I did not give you permission to call me Selina." "Quite so, but as we are to be married, I may as well get used to your Christian name, my dear." "I am not so sure that we will be married," said Mrs. Jasher stiffly. "Oh, but we must," cried Braddock in dismay. "I am depending upon your money to finance my expedition to Queen Tahosa's tomb." "I see," observed the widow coldly, while Lucy sat quietly by and allowed the elder woman to conduct the campaign. "You want me for my money. There is no love in the question." "My dear, as soon as I have the time, say during our voyage to Cairo, whence we start inland up the Nile for Ethiopia, I shall make love whenever you like. And, confound it, Selina, I admire you no end, to use a slang phrase. You are a fine woman and a sensible woman, and I am afraid that you are throwing yourself away on a snuffy old man like myself." "Oh, no." "Oh, pray do not say that," cried Mrs. Jasher, visibly moved by this flattery. "You will make a very good husband if you will only strive to govern your temper." "Temper, temper! Bless the woman, I mean you, Selina. I have the very best temper in the world. However, you shall govern it, and myself also, if you like. Come," he took her hand, "let us be friends and fix the wedding day." Mrs. Jasher did not withdraw her hand. "Then you do not believe that I have anything to do with this terrible murder?" she asked playfully. "No, no, I was heated last night. I spoke rashly and hastily. Forgive and forget, Selina. You are innocent, quite innocent, in spite of the mummy being in your confounded garden. After all, the evidence is stronger against Random than against you. Perhaps he put it there. It's on his way to the fort, you see. Never mind. He has exonerated himself, and no doubt, when confronted with Hervey, will be able to silence that blackguard. And I am quite sure that Hervey is a blackguard. ended Braddock, rubbing his bald head. The two ladies looked at one another in amazement, not knowing what to say. They were ignorant of the theft of the emeralds and of the accusation of Sir Frank by the Yankee skipper. But, with his usual absent-mindedness, Braddock had forgotten all about that, and sat in his chair rubbing his head quite pink and rattling on cheerfully. "I went down with Hope to the embankment," he continued, "but neither of us could see any sign of a boat. There's the rude, short jetty, of course, and if a boat came, a boat could go away without leaving any trace. Perhaps that is so. However, we must wait until we see Don Pedro and Hervey again, and then—" Lucy broke in desperately. "What are you talking about, Father? Why do you bring in Sir Frank's name in that way?" "What do you expect me to say?" retorted the little man. "After all, the manuscript was found in his room, and the emeralds are gone. I saw that for myself, as did Hope and Don Pedro, in whose presence I opened the mummy case." Mrs. Jasher rose in her astonishment. "Are the emeralds gone?" she gasped. "Yes, yes, yes," cried Braddock irritably. "Am I not telling you so? I almost believe in Hervey's accusation of random, and yet the boy exonerated himself very forcibly indeed." "Will you explain all that has happened, Father?" said Lucy, who was becoming more and more perplexed by this rambling chatter. "We are quite in the dark." "So am I, so is Hope, so is everyone," chuckled Braddock. "Ah, yes, of course, you were not present when these events took place." "What events? What events?" demanded Mrs. Jasher, now quite exasperated. "I am about to tell you," snapped her future husband, and related all that had taken place since the arrival of Captain Hervey in the museum at the Pyramids. The women listened with interest and with growing astonishment, only interrupting the narrator with a simultaneous exclamation of indignation when they heard that Sir Frank was accused. "It is utterly and wholly absurd," cried Lucy angrily. "Sir Frank is the soul of honour." "So I think, my dear," chimed in Mrs. Jasher. "And what does he say to?" Braddock interrupted. "I am about to tell you if you will stop talking," he cried crossly. "That is so like a woman. She asks for an explanation and then prevents the man from giving it. Random offers a very good defence, I am bound to say," and he detailed what Sir Frank had said. When the history was finished, Lucy rose to go. "I shall see Archie at once," she said, moving hastily towards the door. "What for?" demanded her father benignly. Lucy turned. "This thing can't go on," she declared resolutely. "Mrs. Jasher was accused by you, Father." "Only in a heated moment," cried the Professor, excusing himself. "Never mind, she was accused," retorted Lucy stubbornly, "and now this sailor accuses Sir Frank. Who knows who will be charged next with committing the crime? I shall ask Archie to take the matter up and hunt down the real criminal. Until the guilty person is found, I foresee that we shall never have a moment's peace." "I quite agree with you," said Mrs. Jasher earnestly. "For my own sake, I wish the matter of this mystery to be cleared up. Why don't you help me?" she added, turning to Braddock, who listened placidly. "I am helping," said Braddock quietly. "I intend to set Cockatoo on the trail at once. He shall take up his abode in the Sailor's Rest on some pretext, and no doubt will be able to find a clue." "What?" cried the widow incredulously. "A savage like that?" "Cockatoo is much cleverer than the average white man," said Braddock dryly, "especially in following a trail. He, if anyone, will learn the truth." "I would much rather trust the Kanaka than young Hope." "Nonsense," cried Lucy, standing up for her lover. "Archie is the one to discover the assassin. I'll see him at once." "And you, Father?" "I, my dear," said the Professor calmly, "shall remain here and make my peace with the future Mrs. Braddock." "You have made it already," said the widow graciously, and extended her hand, which the Professor kissed unexpectedly, and then sat back in his chair, looking quite abashed at his outburst of gallantry. Seeing that everything was going well, Lucy left the elderly couple to continue their courting, and hurried to Archie's lodgings in the village. However, he happened to be out, and his landlady did not know when he would return. Rather annoyed by this, since she greatly desired to unbosom herself, Miss Kendall walked disconsolately towards the Pyramids. On the way she was stopped by Widow Anne, looking more dismal and funereal than ever, and garrulous with copious draughts of gin. Not that she was intoxicated, but her tongue was loose, and she wept freely for no apparent reason. According to herself, she had stopped Lucy to demand back from Mr. Hope through the girl certain articles of attire which had been borrowed for artistic purposes. These, consisting of a shawl and a skirt and a bodice, were of extraordinary value, and Mrs. Bolton wanted them back, or their equivalent in value. She mentioned that she would prefer the sum of £5. "Why do you not ask Mr. Hope yourself?" said Lucy, who was too impatient to bear with the old creature's maunderings. "If you gave him the things he will no doubt return them. If they aren't spiled with paint," wailed Widow Anne. "He told my Sid as he wanted them for a model to wear while being painted. Sid asked me, and I gave 'em to Sid, and Sid he passed 'em along to your good gentleman. There was a skirt, as good as new, and a body of the dress trimmest beautiful, and a tartan shawl as I got from my mother." "But no," the old woman corrected herself, "it was a dark shawl with red spots and—" "Ask Mr. Hope, cried Miss Kendall impatiently. "I know nothing about the things," and she tore her dress from Widow Anne's detaining hand to hurry home. Mrs. Bolton wailed aloud at this desertion, and took her way to Hope's lodgings, where she declared her determination to remain until the artist restored her apparel. Lucy for the moment thought little of this interview, but on reflection she thought it strange that Archie should borrow clothes from Mrs. Bolton through Sydney. Not that there was anything strange in Archie's procuring such garments, since he may have wanted them to clothe a model with. But he could easily have got such things from his landlady, or, if from Widow Anne, could have borrowed them direct without appealing to Sydney. Why, then, had the dead man acted as an intermediate party? This question was hard to answer, yet Lucy greatly wished for a reply, since she suddenly remembered how a woman in a dark dress and with a dark shawl over her head had been seen by Eliza Flight, the housemaid of the Sailor's Rest, talking to Bolton through the window. Were the garments borrowed as a disguise, and did the person who had borrowed them desire that it should be supposed that Widow Anne was talking to her son? There was a chill hand clutching Lucy's heart as she went home, for the words of Mrs. Bolton seemed indirectly to implicate Hope in the mystery. She determined to ask him about the matter straight out when he came in that night to pay his usual visit. At dinner, the Professor was in excellent spirits, and actually became so human as to compliment Lucy on her housekeeping. He also mentioned that he hoped Mrs. Jasher would cater as excellently. Over coffee he informed his stepdaughter that he had entirely won the widow's heart by abasing himself at her feet and withdrawing the accusation. They had arranged to be married in May, 1 or 2 weeks after Lucy became Mrs. Hope. In the autumn they would start for Egypt and would remain abroad for a year or more. "In fact," said the Professor, setting down his cup and preparing to take his departure, "everything is now settled excellently. I marry Mrs. Jasher, you, my dear, marry Hope, and Sir Frank marries Donna Inez," finished Lucy quickly. "That," said Braddock stiffly, "entirely depends upon what de Guyango says to this accusation of Hervey's. Sir Frank is innocent." "I hope so, and I believe so. But he will have to prove his innocence. I shall do my best, and I have sent round to Don Pedro to come here. We can then talk it over." "Can Archie and I come in also?" asked Miss Kendall anxiously. Somewhat to her surprise, the Professor yielded a ready assent. "By all means, my dear. The more witnesses we have, the better it will be. We must do all in our powers to bring this matter to a successful issue." So things were arranged, and when Archie came up to the drawing-room, Lucy informed him that Braddock was in the museum with Don Pedro, telling all that had happened. Hope was glad to hear that Lucy had secured the Professor's consent that they should be present, for the mystery of Bolton's terrible death was piquing him, and he dearly desired to learn the truth. As a matter of fact, although he was unaware of it, he was suffering from an attack of detective fever and wished to solve the mystery. He therefore went gladly into the museum with his sweetheart. Oddly enough, as Lucy recollected when it was too late to speak, she quite forgot to relate what Widow Anne had said about the borrowed clothes. And Pedro, looking more stiff and dignified than ever, was in the museum with Braddock. The two men were seated in comfortable chairs, and Cockatoo, some distance away, was polishing with a cloth the green mummy case of the fatal object which had brought about all the trouble. Lucy had half expected to see Donna Inez, but de Gallangos explained that he had left her writing letters to Lima in the Warrior Inn. When Miss Kendall and Hope were seated, the Peruvian expressed himself much surprised at the charge which had been brought against Sir Frank. "If I can speak of such things in the presence of a lady," he remarked, bowing his head to Lucy. "Oh, yes," she answered eagerly. "I have heard all about the charge. And I am glad that you are here, Don Pedro, for I wish to say that I do not believe there is a word of truth in the accusation." "Nor do I," asserted the Peruvian decisively. I agree," cried Braddock, beaming. "And you, Hope?" "I never believed it, even before I heard Random's defence," said Archie with a dry smile. "Did you not see Captain Hervey yourself, sir?" he added, turning to Don Pedro. "He started for Pierside to look you up." "I have not seen him," said de Gallangos in his stately way, and I am very sorry, as I desire to examine him about the accusation he had dared to bring against my very good friend, Sir Frank Random. I wish he were here at this very minute, so that I could tell him what I think of the charge." Just as Don Pedro spoke, the unexpected happened, as though some genie had obeyed his commands. As though transported into the room by magic, the American skipper appeared, not through the floor, but by the door. A female domestic admitted him and announced his name, then fled to avoid the anger of her master, seeing she had violated the sacred precincts of the museum. Captain Hervey, amused by the surprise visible on every face, sauntered forward, hat on head and chariot in mouth as usual. But when he saw Lucy, he removed both with a politeness scarcely to be expected from so rude and ready and rough a mariner. "I beg pardon for coming here uninvited," said Hervey awkwardly, "but I've been chasing the Don all over Pierside and through this village. They told me at the police office that you," he spoke to de Gallegos, "had doubled on your trail, so here I am for a little private conversation." The Peruvian looked gravely at Hervey's face, which was clearly revealed in the powerful light of the many lamps with which the museum was filled, and rose to bow. "I'm glad to see you, sir," he said politely, and with a still more searching glance. "With the permission of our host, I shall ask you to take a chair," and he turned to Braddock. "Certainly, certainly," said the professor fussily. "Cockatoo." "Pardon, allow me," said de Gallegos, and brought forward a chair, still keeping his eyes on the skipper, who was rather confused by the courtesy. "Will you be seated, Signor? Then we can talk." Hervey sat down quietly close to the Peruvian, who then leaned forward to address him. "You will have a cigarette?" he asked, offering a silver case. "Thanks, no. I'll smoke a chariot if the lady don't mind." "Not at all," replied Lucy, who, along with Archie and the professor, was puzzled by Don Pedro's manner. "Please smoke." In taking back the case, Don Pedro allowed it to drop. As he made no motion of picking it up, Hervey, although annoyed with himself for his politeness towards a yellow stomach, as he called de Gallegos, was compelled to stretch for it. As he handed it back to Don Pedro, the Peruvian's eyes lighted up, and he nodded gravely. "Thank you, Vasa," said de Gallegos, and Hervey, changing colour, leaped from his seat as though touched by a spear point. Chapter 19. Nearer the Truth. For a few moments there was silence. Lucy and Archie sat still, as they were too much surprised by Don Pedro's recognition of Captain Hervey as the Swedish sailor Vasa to move or speak. But the professor did not seem to be greatly astonished, and the sole sound which broke the stillness was his sardonic chuckle. Perhaps the little man had progressed beyond the point of being surprised at anything, or, like Molière's hero, was only surprised at finding virtue in unexpected places. As for the Peruvian and the skipper, they were both on their feet, eyeing one another like two fighting dogs. Hervey was the first to find his very useful tongue. "I guess you've got the bulge on me," said he, trying to outstare the Peruvian, for which nationality, from long voyaging on the South American coast, he entertained the most profound contempt. But in de Gallegos he found a foeman worthy of his steel. "I think not," said Don Pedro quietly, and facing the pseudo-American bravely. "I never forget faces, and yours is a noticeable one. When you first spoke, I fancied that I remembered your voice. All that business with the chair was to get close to you, so that I could see the scar on your right temple. It is still there, I notice. Also, I dropped my cigarette case and forced you to pick it up, so that, when you stretched your arm, I might see what mark was on your left wrist. It is a serpent encircling the sun, which Lola Farjados induced you to have tattooed when you were in Lima 30 years ago. Your eyes are blue and full of light, and as you were 20 when I knew you, the lapse of years has made you 50, your present age." "Shucks," said Hervey coolly, and sat down to smoke. Don Pedro turned to Archie and Braddock. "Mr. Hope." "Professor," he remarked, "if you remember the description I gave of Gustav Vasa, I appeal to you to see if it does not exactly fit this man." "It does," said Archie unhesitatingly, "although I cannot see the tattooed left wrist to which you refer." Hervey, still smoking, made no offer to show the symbol, but Braddock unexpectedly came to the assistance of Don Pedro. "The man is Vasa right enough," he remarked abruptly. "Whether he is Swedish or American, I cannot say, but he is the same man I met when I was in Lima 30 years ago after the war." Hervey slowly turned his blue eyes on the scientist with a twinkle in their depths. "So you recognize me?" he observed with his Yankee drawl. "I recognized you at the moment I hired you to take the diver to Malta to bring back that mummy," retorted Braddock, "but it didn't suit my book to let on." "Didn't you recognize me?" Wall? No, said Hervey, his drawl more pronounced than ever. I haven't got the memory for faces that you and the Don here seem to possess. Ha! He wheeled his chair and faced Braddock squarely. I'd have thought you wiser not to back up the Don, sir. Braddock's little eyes sparkled. I am not afraid of you, said he with great contempt. I never did anything for which you could get money out of me for, Captain Hervey or Gustav Vasa, or whatever your name might be. You were always a mighty spry man, assented the skipper coolly, but spry men, I take it, make mistakes from being too almighty smart. Braddock shrugged his shoulders, and Don Pedro intervened. This is all beside the point, he remarked angrily. Captain Hervey, do you deny that you are Gustav Vasa in the face of this evidence? Hervey drew up the left sleeve of his reefer jacket and showed on his bared wrist the symbol of the sun and the encircling serpent. Is that enough? He drawled, or do you want to look at this? And he turned his head to reveal his scarred right temple. Then you admit that you are Vasa? Wall, drawled the captain again. That's one of my names, I guess, though I haven't used it since I traded that blamed mummy in Paris 30 years ago. There's nothing like owning up. Are you not Swedish? Asked Lucy timidly. I'm a citizen of the world, I guess, replied Hervey with great politeness for him, and America suits me for headquarters as well as any other nation. I might be Swedish or Danish or a Dago for choice. Vasa may be my name, or Hervey, or anything you like. But I guess I'm a man all through. And a thief, cried Don Pedro, who had resumed his seat, but was keeping quiet with difficulty. Not of those emeralds, rejoined the skipper coolly. Lord, to think of the chance I missed. 30 years ago I could have looted them, and again the other day. But I never knew, cried Hervey regretfully, with his vividly blue eyes on the mummy. I could Jesus kick myself, gentlemen, when I think of the miss. Then you didn't steal the manuscript along with the emeralds? Wall, I did, cried Hervey, turning to Archie, who had spoken, but it was in a foreign lingo to which I didn't catch on. If I'd known, I'd have learned about those blamed emeralds. What did you do with the copy of the manuscript you stole? Asked Don Pedro sharply. I know there was a copy, as my father told me so. I have the original myself, but the transcript, and not a translation, as I fancied, appeared in Sir Frank Random's room today, hidden behind some books. Hervey made no move, but smoked steadily, with his eyes on the carpet. However, Archie, who was observing keenly, saw that he was more startled than he would admit. The explanation had taken him by surprise. Explain, cried the Peruvian sharply. Hervey looked up and fixed a pair of very evil eyes on the Don. See here, he remarked, if the lady wasn't present, I'd show you that I take no orders from any yellow, that is, from any low-down Don. Lucy, my dear, leave us, said Braddock, rising, much excited. We must have this matter sifted to the bottom, and if Hervey can explain better in your absence, I think you should go. Although Miss Kendall was very anxious to hear all that was to be heard, she saw the advisability of taking this advice, especially as Hope gave her arm a meaning nudge. I'll go, she said meekly, and was escorted by her lover to the door. There she paused. Tell me all that takes place, she whispered, and when Archie nodded, she vanished promptly. The young man closed the door and returned to his seat in time to hear Don Pedro reiterate his request for an explanation. And s'pose I can't oblige, said the skipper, now more at his ease since the lady was out of the room. Then I shall have you arrested, was the quick reply. For what? For the theft of my mummy. Hervey laughed raucously. I guess the law can't worry me about that after 30 years, and in a low-down country like Peru. Your government has shifted 50 times since I looted the corpse. This was quite true, and there was absolutely no chance of the skipper being brought to book. Don Pedro looked rather disconsolate, and his gaze dropped under the glare of Hervey's eyes, which seemed unfair, seeing that the Don was as good as the captain was evil. You can't expect me to condone the theft, he muttered. I reckon I don't expect anything, retorted Hervey coolly. I looted the corpse, I don't deny, and— After my father had treated you like a son, said Don Pedro bitterly. You were homeless and friendless, and my father took you in, only to find that you robbed him of his most precious possession. The skipper had the grace to blush and shifted uneasily in his chair. You can't say truer than that, he grumbled, averting his eyes. I guess I'm a bad lot all through. But a friend of mine wanted the corpse, and offered me a heap of dollars to see the business through. Do you mean to say that someone asked you to steal it? No, put in Braddock unexpectedly, for I was the friend. You. Don Pedro swung round in great astonishment. but the professor faced him with all the consciousness of innocence. "Yes," he remarked quietly. "As I told you, I was in Peru 30 years ago. I was then hunting for specimens of Inca mummies. Vasa, this man now called Hervey, told me that he could obtain a splendid specimen of a mummy, and I arranged to give him £100 to procure what I wanted. But I swear to you, de Gayangos," continued the little man earnestly, "that I did not know he proposed to steal the mummy from you." "You knew it was the green mummy?" asked Don Pedro sharply. "No, I only knew that it was a mummy. Did Vasa get it for you?" "I guess not," said the gentleman who confessed to that name. The professor went to Cuzco and got into trouble. I was carried off to the mountains by some Indians," interpolated the professor, "and only escaped after a year's captivity. I did not mind that, as it gave me the opportunity of studying a decaying civilization. But when I returned a free man to Lima, I found that Vasa had left the country with the mummy." "That's so," assented Hervey, waving his hand. "I got a berth as second mate on a windjammer sailing to Europe, and as the country wasn't healthy for me since I'd looted the green mummy, I took it abroad and yanked it to Paris, where I sold it for a couple of £100. With that, I changed my name and had a high old time. I never heard of the blamed thing again until the professor here turned up with Mr. Bolton at Pierside, asking me to bring it in the diver from Malta. It was what you'd call a coincidence, I reckon," added Hervey lazily, "but I did cry small when I heard the professor here had paid 900 for a thing I'd let slip for 200. Had I known of those infernal emeralds, I'd have ripped open the case on board and would have recouped myself. But I knew nothing, and Bolton never told me." "How could he?" asked Braddock quietly, "when he did not know that any jewels were buried with the dead?" "I did not know either. And I have explained why I wanted the mummy. But it never struck me until I hear what you say now, that this mummy," he nodded towards the green case, "was the one which you had stolen at Lima from de Gayangos. But you must do me the justice, Captain Hervey, to tell Don Pedro that I never countenanced the theft." "No. You were square enough, I guess." "The sin is on my own blessed shoulders, and I don't ask it to be shifted." "What did you do with the copy of the manuscript?" asked Don Pedro. Hervey ruminated. "I can't think," he mused. "I found a screed of Latin along with the mummy when I looted it from your Lima house, but it dropped out of my mind as to what became of it. Maybe I passed it along to the Paris man, and he sold it along with the corpse to the Maltese gent." "But I tell you this copy was found in Sir Frank's room," insisted de Gayangos. "How did it come to be there?" Captain Hervey rose and took a turn up and down the room. When Cockatoo came in his way, he calmly kicked him aside. "What do you think, Mr. Hope?" he asked, coming to a full stop before Archie, while Cockatoo crept away with a very dark scowl. "I don't know what to think," replied that young gentleman promptly, "save that Sir Frank is my very good friend, and that I take his word that he knows nothing of how the manuscript came to be hidden in his bookcase." "Huh," said Hervey scornfully, and took another turn up and down the room in silence. "I surmise that your friend isn't a white man." Hope leaped to his feet. "That's a lie," he said distinctly. "I'd have shot you for that down Chile way," snapped the skipper. "Possibly," retorted the artist dryly, "but I happen to be handy with my revolver also. I say again that you lie. Random is not the man to commit so foul a crime." "Then how did the manuscript get into his room?" questioned Hervey. "He is trying to learn, and, when he does, will come here to let us all know, Captain Hervey. But I ask you on what grounds you accuse him." "Oh, I know all you said today," added Hope scornfully, waving his hand. "But you can't prove that Random got the manuscript." "If it's in his room, as you acknowledge, I can," said Hervey, speaking in a much more cultivated tone. "See here. As I said before, that copy must have been passed along with the corpse to the Maltese man. Well then, the professor here bought the corpse, and with it the manuscript." "No," contradicted the little man, prodigiously excited. "Bolton wrote to me full particulars of the mummy, but said nothing about any manuscript." "Well, he wouldn't," replied Hervey calmly, seeing that he'd no Latin. "He did know Latin," admitted Braddock uneasily. "I taught him myself." "But do you mean to say that he got that manuscript and read it and intended to keep the fact of the emerald secret?" Hervey nodded 3 times and twisted his cheroot in his mouth. "How else can you figure the business out?" he demanded quietly, and with his eyes fixed on the excited professor. "Bolton must have got that manuscript, as I can't remember what I did with it, save pass it along with the corpse. He, as you admit, doesn't tell you about it when he writes. Well then, I reckon he calculated getting this corpse to England and intended to steal the emeralds when safely ashore." But he could have done that on the boat, said Archie quickly. I guess not, with me about, said Hervey coolly. I'd have spotted his game and would have howled for shares. You dare to say that? Demanded de Gayangos fiercely. Keep your hair on. I dare to say anything that comes up my darned back, you bet. I'm not going to knuckle down to a yellow stomach. Out flew Don Pedro's long arm, and Hervey slammed against the wall. He slipped his hand around to his hip pocket with an ugly smile, but before he could use the revolver he produced, Hope dashed up his arm, and the ball went through the ceiling. Lucy, cried the young man, knowing that the drawing-room was overhead, and in a moment was out of the door, racing up the stairs at top speed. Some sense of shame seemed to overpower Hervey as he thought that he might have shot the girl, and he replaced the revolver in his pocket with a shrug. I climbed down and apologise, he said to Don Pedro, who bowed gravely. Hang you, sir. You might have shot my daughter, cried Braddock. The drawing-room, where she is sitting, is right overhead, and... As he spoke the door opened, and Lucy came in on Archie's arm. She was pale with fright, but had sustained no damage. It seemed that the revolver bullet had passed through the floor some distance away from where she was sitting. I offer my humble apologies, miss, said the cowed Hervey. I'll break your neck, you ruffian, growled Hope, who looked, and was, dangerous. How dare you shoot here and... It's all right, interposed Lucy, not wishing for further trouble. I am all safe. But I shall remain here for the rest of your interview, Captain Hervey, as I am sure you will not shoot again in the presence of a lady. No, miss, muttered the captain, and when again invited by the angry professor to speak, resumed his discourse in low tones. Wall, as I was saying, he remarked, sitting down with a dogged look, Bolton intended to clear with the emeralds, but I guess Sir Frank got ahead of him and packed him in that blamed case, while he annexed the emeralds. He then took the manuscript, which he looted from Bolton's corpse, and hid it among his books, as you say, while he left the blamed mummy in the garden of the old lady you talked about. I guess that's what I say. It's all theory, said Don Pedro in vexed tones. And there isn't a word of truth in it, said Lucy indignantly, standing up for Frank Random. It ain't for me to contradict you, miss, said Hervey, who was still humble. But I ask you, if what I say ain't true, how did that copy of the manuscript come to be in that aristocrat's room? There was no reply made to this, and although everyone present, save Hervey, believed in Random's innocence, no one could explain. The reply came after some further conversation by the appearance of the soldier himself in mess kit. He walked unexpectedly into the room with Donna Inez on his arm, and at once apologised to de Gayangos. I called to see you at the inn, sir, he said, and as you were not there, I brought your daughter along with me to explain about the manuscript. Ah, yes, we talk of that now. How did it come into your room, sir? Random pointed to Hervey. That rascal placed it there, he said firmly.